Do you imagine, people considering a political intervention on the world stage or political involvement, governing involvement that develops types of infrastructure and things along those lines? Do you imagine that if there is some kind of political governing apparatus that interferes with people's lives, a sense of human rights type expectation that people would have, if there's some type of interruptive political entity that disrupts those abilities that someone has for their placement, sustenance, what have you, and especially uses a type of force against that displacement, expansion across, increasing types of displacement. Do you imagine that type of interruptive power being developed into a type of infrastructure, interrupting people's livability, develops within it a sense of, like, if it were a mechanism of a life force connected to a life force and these types of universal rights and whatnot, that if people buy into it or are a part of it, that there is some type of expectation or like a moral compass of balancing the interaction among it unto life. And if so, if there's like an infrastructure along those lines, is it moral to then utilize its type of substitutionary currency? So in a sense, like a political system is like possibly like an infrastructure that draws people into its involvement, that creates a system upon a system. So like a system upon a system of life, if it's interrupting that interaction to some degree, is it expected in a sense then to encompass within it distributing a sense of life sources as people are like drawn into it? I guess what I'm getting to is this idea of the governing system pertaining to life resources for people. And people might say, well, we're not required to offer life resources for people with this infrastructure that we're involved in, this political infrastructure. It kind of gets into the question of taxes and things like that. And, we're not required to meet the needs as we participate in this infrastructure of other people. We get to pick and choose if we want to do that. Whereas these entities and these infrastructures generally tend to pick and choose to create a type of power over others, systemic power, utilizing that infrastructure. And so they generally don't tend to always have a problem with that mechanism of control, like utilizing the system as control or aggression over other groups. But they generally then, to maintain that type of control, don't want to budge on allowing life resources to alleviate pressure on people. And so it's an occupying force, I guess. So if it were the event that when people get into these religious arguments and they're making these suggestions that we don't owe people, we don't need to use the system with some kind of tax base to meet the needs of people. We need to control the needs of people so that this infrastructure is just a power. It just doesn't seem to coincide, like with a religious argument, to then use arguments about picking and choosing when to help people or when not to help people as though it's voluntary. I think if they wanted to depart from the system and just not use the system and not use the infrastructure as a form of aggression over people, if they were to do that, then they could appeal to the scriptures and say, well, we can voluntarily pick and choose who we help or who we don't, as though you live off the land and you pick and choose who you're going to like give your harvest to or whatever. Like that, I feel like that's fair. out of the outpouring of your heart, you decide to give your harvest. But if you're part of an infrastructure that is interfering with other people's harvest in life, to have a moral aspect within that system, it would seem that you would use an infrastructure system that interferes with people's lives to balance the resources and to share the mechanisms by which they would have some kind of life sustenance, so that the system infrastructure is a life sustenance mechanism upon a life sustenance mechanism, of which is creation. And, if people, I think it's fair enough for people to say, well, you can't use the infrastructure, though, to misuse taxes and to counterbalance it as other forms of weaponization, so then it gets into these political domains of people seeming to undermine resources given to people, or utilizing, warring over the infrastructure to maybe undermine the occupying force and where it selects for, or using the mechanisms of, maybe the taxes as a type of developing resources for people with other ulterior motives. Basically, there does seem to be an argument for creating better forms of using it more fairly and with integrity. And so if that were more of the argument of balancing out the occupying force with meeting the needs and where the money goes and whatnot, or even apart from that, just the better strategy of what produces, because what you also want within a population is like what produces to incentivize getting people to help relieve the burden or the of the system, delegating areas and points of reference and participation. And I think too, like, people attempt to try to pressure types of participation, but I don't know that they're always understanding how they're trying to like spur on participation. And they generally tend to use it gets into a longer topic, like what are the pressure points that are used to try to get people to participate in carrying the load and the burden of this functional infrastructure system. Like, as an example, historical tensions get fueled through these discussions where they'll say, well, why do we have to pay more of the taxes and then other groups don't? Or why do they get this benefit and other, da-da-da-da-da. But even built into that, like, there are corrective measures, but a lot of times too, there has been a historical approach to the imbalance and a difficulty for groups to like equalize it a little bit more because there's ideologies built into it. And at some level, there is the point of just meeting universal human needs without the ideologies, and then going from there into like how to equalize things a little bit more. And it could even be there could be stages of repair that could be done within the system. And then eventually it gets to an even better cohesive working system once it rebalances out the like improper selecting for ideologies and whatnot. Anyway, a lot more to be said about that. It was just something I was processing with these various comments and whatnot pertaining to like systems and like taxes and meeting the needs of people, and then in relation to voluntarily meeting the needs of people and whatnot.